From Brandstar Studios at Florida Atlantic University, I'm Dr. Kevin Wagner, the co-director of the Political Communication Laboratory.
And I'm Dr. Luzmarina Garcia, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Florida Atlantic University and researcher with the FAU Polling Initiative.
Today, Dr. Garcia and I are going to talk about our latest poll, which is a national measure of the presidential race. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact of President Biden dropping out of the race. That was a bit expected, yet still unexpected.
What do you think this means for the overall race?
Yeah, this is one of those things that's very, very hard to tell because, you know, I don't like to use the word unprecedented, but once again, we're in really unusual grounds where something is happening that we don't have a lot of data to make a big projection from. But early on, the suggestion is that the partisan lanes are going to stay pretty close to where they are, but we'll have to see who eventually gets the nomination, whether it's Vice President Harris, and whether or not she's able to consolidate the Democrats around her. That's going to be the big question going forward. But in this particular poll, we're going to take a look at the state of the race just as Biden was deciding to drop out.
That's exactly right. And remember, we're only a couple months away from the general election. So we're all trying to find out how exactly it's going to play out closer to the election as well.
So our initial numbers we're looking at here are the state of the race on the day that Joe Biden decided to drop out of the race. What do these numbers tell us about maybe the motivation for President Biden to step aside?
That's right. So we see here from our previous polls, including and this one, we see a negative trend line. So it's 41% approval of President Biden, and we have 49% for President Donald Trump. So this low rating must have factored into the decision of leaving the race. And we see, again, a 5% undecided, which, again, the election is still kind of far out, and 5% has held steady since we started polling these questions.
Yeah, I think one of the truths here it isn't necessarily the size of the gap, which, you know, it's not insurmountable, but the fact that the trend line has continued to move away from Joe Biden, especially since the debate performance, and then each subsequent time that these measures have gone in, it looks like Joe Biden is losing ground. It's hard to, you know, not hard to imagine that that trend line is part of what made him decide to step away. That's
right.
If you found this video helpful in understanding contemporary American politics, please hit the like button and feel free to subscribe. You can also follow us at faupolling.com.
Our poll also included a ballot test between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. What do we see here, Dr. Kevin Wagner?
Yeah, the most interesting thing is that the race appears to be a bit tighter for Vice President Harris and former President Trump than it did with President Joe Biden. Again, another indicator that we might have seen about why President Biden was willing to step aside here. And this, you know, what's important to consider here too, this is also before you know, Joe Biden stepped aside. So this was before Vice President Harris was really the center character, the focus of the election. It suggests that she probably has some more room to grow here. So I think if they were looking at these numbers, especially on the Democratic side, they were probably thinking that Vice President Harris might actually be a more competitive candidate going forward.
It seems to read that way.
So one of the things we were taking a look at in this particular poll is what would happen if President Joe Biden stepped aside, and essentially what the Democratic Party should do. Should they just go with Vice President Harris, or should they consider the possibility of allowing the convention to decide the candidate? And so, so we got some interesting number here, Dr. Garcia.
That's right. So approximately 57% of our sample said that they believe that the delegates at the Democratic National Convention should be choosing the presidential candidate for the Democratic ticket, while 43% said that it should be Vice President Harris and we should not pass her up. And what's interesting here is that around 70% of individuals that identified as Republicans said that it should be the delegates that should be choosing that next Democratic candidate.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Democrats are going to want to take the advice of the Republicans on this particular one. And if you actually look at what Democrats thought, there was actually a lot more support for Vice President Harris in the Democratic numbers, which suggests that she really does have a chance to consolidate this before the convention.
That's right.
So one of the things we also wanted to look at was the approval rating for Vice President Harris going forward. And this was going to give us an idea how voters are seeing the vice president before she became sort of the front runner for the nomination. And so what do these numbers look like?
So it seems that there's about 44% favorable outcomes for Vice President Harris, but we do have a big faction here, almost 50%, that have unfavorable views of Vice President Harris. And so what this means is that it's still going to take some serious consolidating, some serious campaigning leading to the general election.
Yeah, I think the approval number probably is okay at 44% because she should theoretically have room to grow as the electorate gets to know her a bit better. What would worry me a little bit if I were working in the Harris campaign is the strength of the unfavorable number. That suggests that many people already have an opinion, and that's not necessarily a positive one. So there's definitely some, I agree with you, there's definitely some work she's going to need to do here.
We also wanted to take a look at voters' views of former President Donald Trump. And what do you see here, Dr. Wagner?
Yeah, two things jump out at me. The first is that there's so few undecideds here. One of the things that has consistently been true about the former president is that whether they have a positive opinion or a negative opinion, people have an opinion. The second thing is this is a pretty good high watermark for the former president, up at about 49% approval. It's to be expected to some degree because this is what we'd call the post-convention balance, where the Republican Party has consolidated around the former president. So you can see his strength in these numbers. The question for former President Trump going forward is, can he hold on to this level of support, or as the campaign starts to move, whether those numbers will come back down to where they typically have been.
That's right. What we're also seeing here is that there has been a shooting incident in Pennsylvania, so perhaps there is a heightened kind of poll for President Trump at this moment.
Yeah, you would expect to see some of that circling of the wagons a bit, especially on the Republican side, and certainly with some independent voters as well to support the former president. Again, I guess the ultimate question will be, to what degree is that support sustainable? So we were curious who was watching the conventions, because most modern political conventions no longer have a functional purpose. The candidate is usually decided well ahead of time. So the question is, who wants to watch these things? What do you think when we looked at the numbers of who was watching the GOP convention?
Well, I don't think many people, aside from political scientists, are watching it with, on pins and needles or anything. It's not great viewing. However, I will say that the RNC was a large event, and by most accounts a successful event. And so we see here that people did watch it. About 24% of people said that they watched all of it, 34% saying that they watched some of it. And so what we see here is quite a few, the majority of our sample were actually watching the RNC, which is surprising to myself, but I also want to take this with a grain of salt, because as political scientists, we know that it is socially desirable for people to say that they're more in tune with political life than they actually are. So they identify with the kind of political activities that they're a part of. And again, this not being the best TV around, really, it's not all that entertaining.
Yeah, I suspect the numbers, I agree with you, these numbers are probably elevated. That has a lot to do with that social desirability. When people ask you on the phone, did you watch this? You don't want to say, no, I was watching, SpongeBob on a different channel, right? Because you want people to think that you're engaged and active in your community and politics. And so sometimes these numbers get a little bit elevated. With that said, I think one takeaway here is that as an event, it probably was well watched.
Since we are talking about the Republican National Convention, you would think that most of the viewership would be Republican, but what we actually see here is that we have quite a mixed bag in the viewership. What do you think about this, Dr. Wagner?
Yeah, it's not that unusual to expect that people from different parties would watch a convention, because it is, the big political event, and people who are politically attentive are interested in watching these kinds of things, maybe for slightly different reasons about what they want to get out of the event. And also, again, there's the social desirability factor here too, because even Democrats want to say, look, I'm open-minded enough to watch the convention, and so you'll get a bit of a mixed bag. There is a bit of a difference here, though. There's more Republicans that said they watched that, and that has something to do with the fact that this does tend to become more of a pep rally as it moves on.
I agree.
One of the things that we like to test in our polling on a regular basis is the sense of happiness or unhappiness that Americans have, especially considering how tense the political season tends to be. This time we asked the happiness question. We were actually somewhat surprised to see that the happiness indicator came back very, very positive. Almost, if you take a look at it, 24% very happy and 46% at least somewhat happy, which is a much higher happiness ratio than we would have expected. I think there's a message here sometimes that despite the fact that our politics can be very tense, especially if you're consuming it on social media, But nonetheless, Americans in general are not as unhappy as it sometimes seems if you follow just the news or the angry conversations that happen in social media. But we'll keep an eye on this one because the happiness meter can vary from time to time as the situation and context change. From Brandstar Studios at Florida Atlantic University, this has been a presentation of the Political Communication Laboratory. I want to thank my partner, Dr. Garcia, for joining me today.
Great to be here.
We have some exciting new polls coming up in the future, including some more state polls and some national polls. And what else we got, Dr. Garcia?
Well, as we've seen, it's been a very momentous and unique election cycle. So we can't wait to share our next polls with you and more information and analysis. And again, it's going to be a very exciting lead up to this election in November.